The fire burned steadily in the stone pit, while the blizzard outside buried the cabin under 6 feet of snow. Micah Thornton had not added wood to the fire in 8 hours, yet the stones radiated heat that kept the interior above freezing. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story is even more incredible than this one. The wind had been screaming for 72 hours. Snow piled against the north wall of Micah Thornton's cabin in drifts that reached past the window. Inside, the fire burned low in the massive stone structure that dominated the eastern wall. Micah sat at his table, carving a new axe handle, occasionally glancing at the flames, but not moving to feed them. The stones glowed with absorbed heat, radiating warmth that filled the single room. Outside, the temperature had dropped below zero. Inside, Micah worked in his shirt sleeves. This was December 1839 in the Blue Ridge Mountains of what would become West Virginia. The blizzard that had trapped Micah in his cabin was the third major storm of an unusually brutal winter. For 3 days, visibility outside had been measured in feet, not miles. Wind drove snow horizontally with enough force to strip bark from exposed trees. The cold was the kind that killed quickly, that turned exposed skin black in minutes, that made breathing painful. Micah had not left his cabin since the storm began. He had not needed to. His wood pile was inside, stacked beneath his sleeping platform. His water barrel was full, filled before the storm arrived. His food supplies would last 2 weeks if necessary. And most importantly, his fire required almost no attention. Every 8 hours he added 3 logs to the stone pit. The fire never went out, the stones never cooled. The cabin stayed warm enough that ice never formed on the water barrel, that his breath never fogged, that he could sleep without piling on every blanket he owned. Other trappers and settlers scattered through these mountains were not so fortunate. Micah knew this because he had been one of them the previous winter. He knew what it meant to feed a fire every 2 hours during a storm, to wake shivering in darkness because the fire had died while you slept, to burn furniture and floorboards in desperation when the woodpile outside became unreachable. He knew because he had done all those things, and he knew because his partner had frozen to death doing them. The fire pit that now kept him comfortable had not existed a year ago. The massive structure of stacked river stones, the open design, the wooden shelf positioned to capture and redirect heat, all of it had come from obsession born of tragedy. Micah had spent 6 months building what other settlers called a waste of time and effort. They had mocked the size of it, questioned his sanity, suggested he had lost his mind to grief. But now, 3 days into a blizzard that was killing people across the region, Micah sat warm and safe. His fire burned steadily with minimal feeding. His stones held heat like a battery. The winter of 1838 had been Philip Mercer's 3rd season trapping in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He and Micah had partnered that fall, pooling resources to build a cabin near the headwaters of the Greenbrier River. The location was ideal for trapping, remote enough to avoid competition, close enough to a trading post for supply runs before winter locked the mountains down. Their cabin was standard construction for the region. Logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace built against the back wall, a single door facing south to catch whatever sun the short winter days provided. They had completed it in 5 days, working from dawn until dark. The fireplace drew well, the roof kept out rain, the door fit snugly. By frontier standards, it was a sound structure. The first heavy snow came in late November. Micah and Philip settled into the rhythm of winter trapping. They checked lines when weather permitted, processed pelts, maintained equipment, and kept the fire burning. The fireplace required constant attention. Every 2 hours during the day, someone added wood. At night, they banked coals and hoped the fire would last until morning. Often, it did not. On January 9, 1839, a storm moved into the mountains with unusual speed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours. Snow began falling just after noon, thick flakes that accumulated rapidly. By nightfall, visibility was measured in yards. The wind picked up after dark, driving snow against the cabin walls with force that made the logs creak. Micah and Philip fed the fire heavily before sleeping. But this storm was different. The wind created pressure changes that affected the fireplace draft. Downdrafts pushed smoke back into the cabin. The fire struggled, flaring and dying unpredictably. Around midnight, Micah woke to cold. The fire had gone out completely. The cabin interior was already below freezing. Philip was awake, trying to restart the fire with kindling. Snow had drifted against the door. Their main woodpile was outside, beneath a lean-to attached to the cabin's south wall. Philip got the fire restarted using kindling from their indoor supply. They had perhaps a dozen pieces of split wood inside, enough for a few hours. The fire caught, burned, provided temporary warmth. But within an hour, another downdraft killed it again. They tried again, used more of their indoor wood supply. The pattern repeated 3 times. By 4 in the morning, their indoor wood was gone. They had no choice but to access the outdoor woodpile. Philip volunteered. He was younger, stronger, more confident. He dressed in every layer he owned, wrapped a scarf across his face, and pushed through the door into the blizzard. Micah watched from the doorway. The lean-to was 15 feet away. In clear weather, the trip took seconds. Philip disappeared into the white. Micah counted. 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds. At 2 minutes, he stepped outside himself, shouting Philip's name. No response. He moved toward the lean-to, fighting wind that pushed him sideways. He found Philip collapsed against the woodpile, arms full of split logs, unconscious. Micah dragged him back to the cabin. Philip's face was white. His breathing was shallow. Micah stripped off Philip's frozen outer layers and wrapped him in blankets. He built a fire using furniture, breaking apart their table. Philip never woke up. He died just before dawn. The storm continued for another day and a half. Micah burned nearly everything in the cabin to stay alive. When the weather finally broke, he buried Philip on the hillside above the cabin. Spring came late to the Blue Ridge Mountains in 1839. Snow lingered in shaded hollows until April. Micah remained at the cabin through the worst of winter, trapping, mechanically, processing pelts without enthusiasm. Philip's grave on the hillside was a constant reminder of how quickly the mountains could kill. When the ice finally broke on the Greenbrier River in early April, Micah made the 3-day journey to the trading post at Marlinton. He sold his winter's take of pelts for a fair price, bought basic supplies, and returned to the cabin. Other trappers assumed he would abandon the location. But Micah stayed. He had decided something during the long winter months alone. The fireplace that had failed them obsessed him. He spent hours staring at it, analyzing why it had not worked when they needed it most. The chimney drew adequately under normal conditions. But during a whiteout blizzard, wind pressure overwhelmed temperature differential. Downdrafts pushed smoke and cold air back into the cabin, choking the fire. Micah began walking the riverbanks. The Greenbrier and its tributaries had exposed countless smooth stones over millennia of flow. He picked them up, felt their weight, noted which ones retained warmth from the sun longer than others. Dense river stones held heat. He could feel it when he held them in his hands after they had been in direct sunlight. He started collecting stones. At first, he brought back a few each day, piling them near the cabin without clear purpose. Then he became more systematic. He wanted stones that were relatively flat, that would stack securely, that were large enough to have mass, but small enough to carry. He spent entire days at the river, selecting stones, hauling them back in a canvas sack he had sewn for the purpose. By late April, he had accumulated several hundred stones. Other trappers passing through the area noticed. Solomon Vance stopped by in early May and found Micah sorting stones by size and shape. Solomon asked what the stones were for. Micah said he was building something but offered no details. Solomon studied the pile and decided not to press. Men dealt with grief in different ways. Ethan Blackwell and Gideon Hayes visited together in mid-May. They found Micah at the river, wading in cold water up to his knees, examining stones on the riverbed. After 20 minutes, Micah emerged with 3 stones, each weighing perhaps 30 pounds. Ethan asked directly what Micah was doing. Micah said he was building a fire pit that would not go out during storms. Ethan and Gideon exchanged glances. They knew about Philip's death. They understood Micah's motivation, but the logic was unclear. Micah tried to explain. Stones held heat. A large mass of stones would hold heat longer than a small mass. If you built a fire structure from stones instead of just using stones to line a firebox, the entire structure would become a heat source. The fire would heat the stones. The stones would radiate heat back into the room. Even if the fire went out, the stones would continue providing warmth for hours. Gideon pointed out that every fireplace used stones. Micah agreed, but said standard fireplaces used the minimum stones necessary. He wanted to use the maximum stones possible to create thermal mass that would dwarf anything currently being built. He wanted a stone structure so large that it would function as a heat battery, storing energy from the fire and releasing it slowly. Construction began in June 1839. Micah tore down the existing fireplace stone by stone, salvaging what he could but rejecting most of it. The stones were too small, too irregular, insufficiently dense. He wanted his river stones, the ones he had selected specifically for their thermal properties and stacking characteristics. He started with the foundation. Standard fireplaces sat directly on the cabin floor or on a minimal stone base. Micah dug down 2 feet, creating a pit that extended 4 feet square. He filled this excavation with his largest, flattest river stones, fitting them together like puzzle pieces. The foundation alone consumed 3 days of work and several hundred pounds of stone. When completed, it was level, solid, and extended slightly above the original floor line. The walls rose slowly. Micah used dry stacking technique, placing each stone carefully to maximize contact with adjacent stones. He selected stones that nested together naturally, that distributed weight downward rather than outward. No mortar, no clay, no material between stones except their own mass holding them in place. Each stone supported those above it. Each layer locked the layer below. He built the structure wider than standard fireplaces. The base measured 4 feet square. As it rose, he angled the walls inward slightly, creating stability through geometry. At 3 feet height, the interior fire chamber measured roughly 2 feet square. But the walls continued rising past this point, surrounding the fire chamber with mass. At 4 feet height, Micah created the shelf. He selected flat stones that extended inward from each wall, creating a platform that partially covered the fire chamber below. The stones bridged the gap, supported by the walls, locked in place by their own weight and the careful positioning of stones above them. The shelf was not solid. Gaps between stones allowed heat and smoke to rise. But the platform created a barrier that captured and redirected heat outward into the room. Above the shelf, the walls continued rising, narrowing to form a chimney. But this chimney was different from standard construction. It was wider, shorter, and surrounded by more mass. The opening at the top was broad enough to draft properly, but not so tall that wind pressure could create the downdrafts that had killed Philip. The entire structure reached 7 feet at its highest point. It consumed nearly 2,000 individual stones. The mass was enormous. Micah estimated the total weight exceeded 4 tons. The cabin floor, built on solid ground with support beams, held the weight without sagging. Other trappers who visited during construction expressed open disbelief. Lucas Harmon stopped by in July and called it insanity. He said Micah was building a monument, not a fireplace. He said the effort was wasted, that no fire pit needed that much stone, that Micah had lost perspective. Solomon Vance returned in August and simply stared. He walked around the structure, studying it from every angle. He asked how long it had taken. Micah said 3 months so far, and it was not finished. Solomon asked if Micah truly believed it would work better than a standard fireplace. Micah said he would know when winter came. By September, the structure was complete. Micah had built what the small trapping community was already calling Crane's Folly. It dominated the cabin interior, massive and strange, unlike anything built in these mountains before. October 1839 brought the first hard frost to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Micah had spent September preparing for winter, running trap lines, processing the early season's pelts and stockpiling firewood. He split and stacked 3 cords inside the cabin, learning from the previous winter's mistake. The wood pile beneath his sleeping platform would last months without requiring trips outside during storms. On October 12th, the temperature dropped enough that Micah decided to light the first fire in his stone structure. He had avoided testing it during summer and early fall, wanting to evaluate its performance under actual cold conditions when heat retention would matter. Now, with overnight temperatures approaching freezing, the time had come. He built the fire carefully. Kindling arranged in a small teepee structure, larger splits stacked around it, seasoned hardwood placed strategically to create sustained burn. He lit the kindling and watched as flames caught and spread. The fire burned exactly as fires had always burned. Smoke rose through the structure and out the chimney. Heat radiated from the flames. Nothing seemed unusual or particularly impressive. The fire burned through the morning. Micah fed it periodically, maintaining steady flames, allowing the structure to heat thoroughly. By noon, he could feel warmth radiating from the stones when he placed his hand near them. The surface stones were hot to the touch. The mass was absorbing heat, exactly as he had intended. He maintained the fire through the afternoon and into evening. By nightfall, the entire stone structure radiated heat. Not just near the fire chamber, but throughout the mass. Even stones 4 feet from the flames felt warm. The cabin interior was comfortable, warmer than it had ever been with the old fireplace. Before sleeping, Micah let the fire burn down to coals. He did not add new wood. This was the test. How long would the stones continue providing heat after the fire died? He lay on his sleeping platform and waited. 2 hours after the flames died completely, the cabin remained warm. The stones glowed dully in darkness, invisible but present. Micah could feel heat radiating from the structure across the room. 4 hours after the fire died, the cabin was still comfortable. He slept without needing extra blankets. He woke at dawn. 6 hours had passed since he had added wood to the fire. The coals were cold, but the cabin interior was still above freezing. The stones, when he touched them, remained warm. Not hot, but significantly warmer than the surrounding air. They had retained heat through the entire night. Micah rebuilt the fire, adding kindling to cold coals, coaxing flames back to life. The structure responded quickly. Within minutes, heat was building again. The stones that had cooled overnight warmed rapidly, their mass ready to absorb and store energy again. He spent the next week conducting experiments. He varied fire sizes, tested different burning intervals, measured how long stones retained heat under different conditions. The results were consistent. The massive stone structure functioned exactly as a thermal battery. It absorbed heat during active burning and released it slowly over extended periods. A fire that burned for 6 hours provided warmth for 12 to 16 hours afterward. December 18, 1839, began with falling barometric pressure and a gray sky that promised heavy snow. Micah had learned to read weather signs during his years in the mountains. The particular quality of light, the behavior of birds, the way wind moved through trees all told stories to those who paid attention. This storm would be significant. Snow began falling just after noon. Large flakes descended steadily, accumulating quickly on ground already covered from previous storms. By evening, visibility had decreased to less than 50 yards. The temperature dropped sharply after dark. Wind picked up around midnight, transforming steady snowfall into a whiteout blizzard. Micah fed his fire pit heavily before the storm intensified. He filled the fire chamber with split hardwood, creating a fire that burned hot and steady. The stones absorbed heat for hours. By the time he banked the fire for the night, the entire structure radiated warmth that filled the cabin. He woke the next morning to complete white outside his window. Snow had drifted against the north wall, covering the lower half of the window opening. Wind drove snow horizontally with force that made the cabin walls creak. The temperature outside was well below zero. Inside, the cabin remained comfortable. The fire had burned down to coals overnight, but the stones continued radiating stored heat. Micah added 3 logs to the coals. The fire caught quickly, flames spreading across the wood. He did not need to tend it constantly. The structure's design created airflow that sustained combustion without constant adjustment. He ate breakfast, worked on equipment repairs, and checked the fire every few hours. The storm continued through the day and into the next night. Micah maintained his routine: 3 logs every 8 hours. The fire burned steadily, the stones stayed hot. The cabin interior remained warm enough that he never needed to wear his heavy coat inside, never woke shivering, never worried about the fire dying during sleep. On the second day, the storm intensified. Wind speeds increased. Snow accumulation buried the woodpile outside completely. Micah was grateful for his indoor supply. He would not need to venture outside until the storm broke. His water barrel held enough for drinking and cooking. His food supplies were adequate. And, most importantly, his fire required minimal attention while providing maximum heat. On the third day, the wind finally decreased. Snow continued falling, but without the driving force that had created whiteout conditions. By evening, the storm was ending. Micah looked outside at a transformed landscape. Drifts reached 6 feet against the cabin's north wall. Trees were buried to their lower branches. The entire world was white and silent. He checked his woodpile. He had used perhaps 1/5 of his indoor supply during 3 days of continuous storm. In previous winters, 3 days of that intensity would have consumed all available wood and required desperate measures. Now, with his stone fire pit, he had maintained comfort while using fuel efficiently. The test was complete. The structure worked exactly as intended. During the deadliest conditions the Blue Ridge could produce, Micah had stayed warm and safe. The fire that would not die had proven itself. January 1840 brought another storm system to the Blue Ridge Mountains. This one arrived without the intensity of December's whiteout, but lasted longer, dropping snow steadily for 5 days. Solomon Vance was caught between the trading post at Marlinton and his own cabin when the weather turned. He made the decision to push toward Micah's location rather than attempt the longer journey home. He arrived on the second day of the storm, exhausted and half frozen. Micah heard him calling from outside and opened the door. Solomon stumbled in, covered in snow, his beard frozen white. He stood shaking in the doorway while Micah secured the door against wind and drifting snow. The warmth hit Solomon immediately. He had expected cold, the desperate internal chill that characterized every frontier cabin he had ever entered during winter storms. Instead, the interior was genuinely warm. He looked around, confused, until his eyes settled on the massive stone structure. The fire burned low but steady. Heat radiated from stones in waves he could feel across the room. Micah helped Solomon remove his frozen outer layers and positioned him near the stone structure. Solomon extended his hands toward the stones, not toward the fire itself. The radiant heat from the stone mass was more comfortable than direct fire heat, warming without scorching. He sat in silence for 20 minutes, thawing, absorbing warmth that penetrated deep into cold muscles. Finally, he spoke. He asked how long the fire had been burning. Micah said he had added wood 6 hours earlier. Solomon looked at the small fire, looked at the warm cabin, looked back at Micah. 6 hours between feedings during a blizzard was impossible with standard fireplaces. Yet here he sat, comfortable and warm, in conditions that should have required constant fire tending. Solomon stayed for 3 days while the storm continued. He watched Micah's routine. 3 logs every 8 hours, no urgency, no constant monitoring, no panic when the fire burned low. The stones did the work. They absorbed heat during active burning and released it steadily between feedings. The cabin never got cold. The fire never went out. On the second day, Solomon asked detailed questions. How deep was the foundation? What type of stones worked best? How were the walls structured to support the shelf? Why was the chimney shorter than standard construction? Micah answered everything, explaining thermal mass, principles, weight distribution, airflow dynamics. He had learned through observation and experimentation what trained architects might have taught from books. Solomon walked around the structure repeatedly, studying it from every angle. He touched stones at different heights, feeling how heat distributed through the mass. He examined the fire chamber, the shelf system, the chimney opening. He was seeing something unprecedented, something that solved problems he had lived with for years without realizing solutions were possible. When the storm finally broke, Solomon prepared to leave. Before departing, he asked Micah a direct question. Would Micah share this design with others? Micah said yes. He had not built it for profit or recognition. He had built it to survive. If others could benefit, that was enough. Solomon nodded, thanked him, and headed home. Within 2 weeks, word had spread. Spring 1840 brought visitors to Micah's cabin with unusual frequency. Word had spread through the scattered trapping community about Crane's fire pit, the stone structure that kept cabins warm through the worst storms with minimal wood consumption. Most trappers were skeptical, but enough had heard accounts from Solomon Vance that curiosity overcame doubt. Ethan Blackwell arrived in late March with specific intent. He had survived a difficult winter in a standard cabin, burning through his entire wood supply and nearly freezing during a week-long storm in February. He wanted to see Micah's structure firsthand and learn if the stories were accurate. Micah showed him everything. He explained the foundation depth, the stone selection process, the dry stacking technique that required no mortar. He demonstrated how weight distributed through the structure, how each stone locked those around it in place through geometry and mass alone. He detailed the fire chamber dimensions, the shelf construction, the chimney design that prevented downdrafts. Ethan took notes on paper he had brought specifically for this purpose. He sketched rough diagrams, recorded measurements, asked questions about every detail. How many stones? Approximately 2,000. How long to build? 3 months working alone. What type of stones worked best? Dense river stones with flat surfaces for stacking. Could mountain stones work? Possibly. But river stones were superior for thermal retention. Gideon Hayes arrived 2 weeks later with similar questions. He and Ethan had discussed building structures based on Micah's design, but wanted to confirm details before beginning construction. Micah walked him through the entire process again, patient with repetition, willing to share everything he had learned. By May, 3 trappers in the region were building stone fire pits modeled on Micah's design. The results varied based on individual skill and stone quality. Ethan's structure, built with careful attention to every detail Micah had provided, functioned nearly as well as the original. The stones he selected were appropriate. His stacking technique was sound. His measurements were accurate. Gideon's attempt was less successful initially. He used mountain stones instead of river stones, and they did not retain heat as effectively. The structure worked better than a standard fireplace, but did not match the performance of Micah's version. He visited Micah again in June, explained the problem, and received advice about stone selection. He rebuilt portions of his structure using river stones and saw immediate improvement. Lucas Harmon, who had mocked the project during construction, began building his own version in July. He did not visit Micah or ask questions, relying instead on second-hand descriptions. His structure was too small, using insufficient stone mass to create the thermal battery effect. It provided marginal improvement over standard fireplaces, but nothing revolutionary. Other trappers watched these early attempts with interest. Success encouraged adoption. Failure discouraged it. But the overall trend was clear. Those who built large stone structures with adequate thermal mass using appropriate materials experienced dramatic improvements in winter heating efficiency. Those who cut corners or modified the design excessively saw limited benefits. Micah shared information freely with everyone who asked. He made no attempt to profit from his innovation or claim exclusive rights to the technique. The knowledge spread organically through direct observation and word of mouth. Winter 1841 brought weather that old-timers claimed exceeded anything in living memory. January started cold and grew colder. By mid-month, temperatures remained below zero for 12 consecutive days. Then, on January 23rd, a storm system moved into the Blue Ridge Mountains that would be discussed for decades afterward. Snow began falling on a Thursday morning. Within 6 hours, accumulation measured over a foot. By evening, wind had increased to speeds that tore branches from trees and created drifts that buried small structures completely. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero. Visibility disappeared entirely. The storm continued without pause through Friday, through Saturday, through Sunday, and into Monday. 5 days of continuous blizzard conditions. Micah weathered the storm in complete comfort. His stone fire pit performed flawlessly. He maintained his standard routine of feeding the fire every 8 hours, used less than half his indoor wood supply, and never experienced cold inside the cabin. The stones radiated heat continuously. The cabin interior remained warm enough for him to work without heavy clothing, to sleep without piling on extra blankets, to function normally while outside conditions were lethal. Other trappers and settlers in the region were not so fortunate. Jasper Monroe, who ran a small trading operation from a cabin 15 miles north of Micah's location, survived only by burning furniture, floorboards, and finally the interior door frame. He emerged from the storm with his cabin damaged, his supplies depleted, and mild frostbite on 3 fingers. A trapper named Robert Kincaid, living in a traditional cabin near the Elk River, died on the 3rd day of the storm. His body was found 2 weeks later when neighbors checked on him. The cabin was frozen solid inside. His woodpile, located outside, had become inaccessible when drifts buried the entire structure. He had burned everything inside that would burn and then frozen to death, waiting for the storm to break. 2 other deaths were attributed to the storm in the immediate region. Both involved people who had attempted to travel during the blizzard or who had been caught away from shelter when conditions deteriorated. But Kincaid's death was different. He had been inside his cabin with adequate supplies before the storm. He died because his structure could not keep him warm and his wood supply became unreachable. In contrast, every trapper who had built a stone fire pit based on Micah's design survived comfortably. Ethan Blackwell reported using minimal wood and maintaining warmth throughout the 5 days. Solomon Vance, who had built his own version over the summer, described the storm as merely inconvenient rather than life-threatening. His fire had required so little attention that he spent most of the storm working on equipment repairs and reading. Word of these outcomes spread rapidly. The contrast was too stark to ignore. Traditional cabins had failed catastrophically. Stone fire pit cabins had protected their inhabitants without difficulty. The innovation that many had dismissed as excessive or unnecessary had proven its worth in the most dramatic way possible. The storm that killed 3 people in the region killed 0 people in cabins with proper thermal mass heating. Micah Thornton continued trapping in the Blue Ridge Mountains through 1843. By then, the fur trade was declining, beaver populations were depleted, and markets were shifting toward other goods. He sold his cabin to a young settler named William Hutchins in the spring of 1844 and moved west toward the Ohio Territory where land was available for purchase. He married in 1846 a widow named Sarah who brought 2 children from her previous marriage. They settled on a small farm, raised crops, kept livestock, and lived quietly. Micah rarely spoke about his years in the mountains. His wife knew he had been a trapper, but nothing about the innovation that had changed frontier heating. To Sarah and her children, he was simply a farmer who worked hard and kept to himself. The cabin on the Greenbrier River passed through several owners over the following decades. William Hutchins lived there for 8 years before selling to a family named Thornhill. They occupied it through the 1850s. Later owners included a hunter, a prospector, and eventually a family that used it as a summer retreat. The stone fire pit remained functional through all these transitions, requiring no repairs, no modifications, no maintenance beyond occasional cleaning. By 1860, stone fire pits had become common throughout the Appalachian region. The design was no longer attributed to Micah specifically. Most people building them had learned the technique second-hand or third-hand through observation of existing structures or descriptions from those who had built earlier versions. The innovation had been absorbed into common practice, the way useful techniques always spread in frontier communities. Micah died in April 1868 at age 57. A fever that began as minor illness progressed rapidly. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Marietta, Ohio, next to Sarah, who had died 2 years earlier. His gravestone listed his name, birth, and death dates, nothing more. His children knew little about his past beyond basic facts. He had been a trapper, had moved west, had married their mother. The details were lost. But in the Blue Ridge Mountains, structures he had influenced continued functioning. The original cabin stood until 1891, when the roof finally collapsed from accumulated damage. The stone fire pit remained intact. New owners salvaged the stones for other construction, dismantling the structure carefully, recognizing the quality of material and workmanship. Historians studying Appalachian settlement patterns in the early 1900s noted the prevalence of stone thermal mass heating structures in the region. They attributed the innovation to unnamed frontier builders, practical men who had solved heating problems through observation and experimentation. No records connected the technique to Micah Thornton specifically. His contribution was anonymous, absorbed into the collective knowledge of mountain communities. The principle he had proven remained valid. Thermal mass stores energy. Stone structures radiate heat long after fires die. Proper design eliminates the need for constant fire tending during storms. These facts, learned through necessity and refined through experience, saved lives across multiple generations. The impossible had become routine, engineering had replaced heroism. And the man who started it all was forgotten, his legacy built into stones scattered across mountains he no longer walked.